Welcome to the Real News Network. Today we're joined by Craig Murray. Thanks for joining us, Craig.
Thank you.
Craig, you're the author of the book Murder in Samarkand, and you can see behind you we have the covers of the book. And everyone, I'm sure, is asking, Samarkand is what and where?
Well, Samarkand is a city in Uzbekistan, in the former Soviet Union. Samarkand is a great city which was one of the great centers of Islamic civilization. The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam was written in Samarkand. Algebra was invented in Samarkand. It's a tremendous place.
Maybe not such a tremendous place today. So let me really quickly give a synopsis of what I understand is the basic story. You're assigned as the British ambassador to Uzbekistan. Over your time there, you come to realize that this regime, which you knew was repressive, turns out to be more than just repressive, and maybe, I think you describe it perhaps not totalitarian, but you find out it's totalitarian supercharged, and a level of torture that's not seen in too many places in the world. So tell us your basic story.
Yeah. Now, I was sent there as British ambassador. I was told that Uzbekistan was a valuable ally in the war on terror, an ally especially of the United States, and had given a major air base to the United States. But when I got there, I discovered it was, as you say, a dreadful regime.
And what year did you go?
I went there in 2002.
So in 2002, Uzbekistan has already acted as a base to help the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan.
That's right. Forward mounting base for Afghanistan is in Uzbekistan. And the regime has over 10,000 political prisoners. And many of them are killed every year. They're in terrible, literally Stalinist gulags. They are in the old Stalinist gulags, which are still there, like Jazlik in the middle of the Kizilkum desert. And people are tortured dreadfully, most appalling tortures you can think of on a routine basis. If you're arrested, you're going to be tortured, and that means you're going to have a broken bottle inserted in your anus, you're going to have your neck broken, you're going to have your feet held over a fire, you're going to be suffocated by having a blocked gas mask put on your head. Even I came across instances of children tortured in front of the parents, that kind of thing.
Now, how were you able to verify that this was going on?
Number of ways. On a very few occasions, you could actually meet survivors, people who'd been in jail for a number of years, and for some reason, it's very capricious government. Occasionally, someone would be let out for no apparent reason, and you could actually see the wounds. More often than not, though, we were getting stuff smuggled out of the labour camps, letters smuggled out of the labour camps, photographs smuggled out, and building up evidence in that way.
Now, the Uzbek government has this peculiar geopolitical positioning and relationships. It has very friendly relationships with Putin and Russia. Prior to that, had a very friendly relationship with the United States and Great Britain. Hugo Chavez from Venezuela makes visits every so often, which are friendly visits. What is going on? When everyone must know this is one of the most vile regimes, assuming all this is true, how do you explain all this?
Well, Uzbekistan sits at the heart of Central Asia. It has half the population of Central Asia. It really dominates the region. And Central Asia has the world's largest untapped reserves of oil and gas. So anyone who's interested in acquiring influence over hydrocarbon reserves needs to be in Uzbekistan. The Uzbek government plays this to its own advantage. The Uzbek government has no interest other than its own advantage, and is quite happy to switch between different world powers as it's able to get something out of them.
Talk just before we get more into the geopolitical, tell us a little more about the incident that started to transform you. Because you go as a loyal British diplomat, and by the end of your time there, you've gone public in total opposition to British policy, who wants you to keep calling the Uzbek government your British allies. You condemn them as vile torturers. So what happens to you that gets you from A to B?
Yeah. There were two incidents which happened within the first month I was there, which really opened my eyes. First one was I attended a show trial of an Al-Qaeda terrorist which was on in Tashkent. And I went and looked at it, and an old man was giving evidence that his nephew was a member of Al-Qaeda. And he was giving his evidence, and he was a very old, frail man, and he spoke in a very trembling voice. He was obviously terrified. Everyone in the court was obviously terrified. And suddenly he seemed to find an inner strength from somewhere, and he stood taller, and he said, "It's not true. It's not true. we had never heard of Al-Qaeda. They tortured my children in front of me until I signed this. It's not true. And at that, he was taken out of the court and I presume killed. I mean, never heard of again. But when he said that, I was as close to him as I am to you now. I could have touched him in the court. And you could just tell it was true. It just struck you that suddenly the truth had broken through. The second incident, which arose out of that, was that people were startled in Uzbekistan that a Western diplomat was taking an interest in human rights, because people had no hope and the West really seemed not to care. We were allies of the dictator. So people started to come to me. One old lady came to me and she brought photographs of her son who had been boiled alive in Jazlik camp. His body had been returned to her in a sealed casket, and she'd been ordered to bury it the next morning, which a Muslim would do anyway, without opening the casket. But in the middle of the night, very, very brave old widow, she got the body out of the casket onto a table and took photographs. And they revealed that he'd been boiled alive. When I saw them, I just couldn't imagine what had happened to this person. And I sent them to a leading pathologist in the UK, now the UK's chief pathologist. And he did a report for me on the basis of these detailed photos, which said that he had been boiled to death. Before being boiled to death, one incidental feature is his fingernails had been pulled out. But you can't see something like that.
So you found out about this, and you send these reports back to your home office in London, and they do what?
They told me to think more about commercial interests and less about human rights. In fact, the exact phrase was that they sent me back a reply saying, "We think you are over-focused on human rights," was their exact phrase. But after that, of course, it got worse, because I then started to realise that from all this torture, CIA intelligence reports were actually coming direct from these torture sessions.
The Uzbek government was giving these reports to the CIA. And these were Uzbeks, or were there more than Uzbeks as the targets of the torture?
While I was there, I was only aware of Uzbeks. I knew that the CIA was regularly receiving intelligence reports from Uzbeks being tortured and confessing to be members of Al-Qaeda. I didn't know while I was there that it was also happening to non-Uzbeks. I did know that the CIA were flying people in, and I reported that to London, but the CIA were flying people in to be tortured, and I reported that officially to London in as many words. And this is in 2003, before anyone had heard the words extraordinary rendition. I didn't realise that the people being flown in were not Uzbek. The idea that strangers would be flown in to be tortured.
Now, subsequently, how do you know that that's the case? Because essentially you're saying the CIA was flying people in to be tortured in Uzbekistan. Yeah,
I knew the CIA people who did it. There weren't many expats in Uzbekistan. You're talking quite seriously of, not including military personnel, 300 or 400 British and American expatriates in the whole of the country. So, not surprisingly, we used to drink in the same bars and meet. And I actually knew the CIA people who flew people in. Subsequently, we've learned a great deal more. For example, the Council of Europe inquiry into extraordinary rendition showed that 90% of the flights which took prisoners to the secret base in Poland at Shimano-Shimony flew on to Tashkent as their next destination. There's a great deal of other evidence that this was part of a global transportation of prisoners.
And do you believe that it's stopped? President Obama has said this kind of activity has stopped, but do you believe that's the case?
There was a hiatus between the Uzbeks and the Bush administration when in 2004 they fell out over the gas, or 2005, they fell out over the gas contracts, which is what the whole relationship was about in the first place.
Just quickly, from what I know of it, those gas contracts originally were going to go to some friends of the Bush family or political allies of the Bush family. Eventually wound up going to the Russians, and perhaps as part of a kind of a Russian turn on this behalf of Uzbekistan.
Yeah. What happened was Enron in 1998, when George Bush was still governor of Texas, Enron invited the Uzbek ambassador to Texas. And Enron met with the Uzbek ambassador actually in the governor's mansion in Texas with George W. Bush. There's actually a facsimile copy of the letter from Lay to Bush. And this whole relationship between Uzbekistan and the United States was founded on the Enron gas contract.
And this letter is signed by Ken Lay at the bottom.
Yeah, this is a letter from Ken Lay to George Bush. Rather amusingly, it was typed, "Dear Governor Bush," and he crossed it out and put George. And at that time, to be fair to the Democrats, Madeleine Albright and James Rubin had made very strong speeches against the Uzbek dictatorship, and the official American policy was of non-cooperation. That was the federal policy, if you like, but George Bush in Texas was running a Texan policy of being as cozy as possible with this dictator in order to get at the gas.
What year is this?
This is 1998. 1998. Then when Bush came to power, before September the 11th, the relationship with Uzbekistan entirely changed. It became much cozier. Karimov was invited to Washington.
And just to put this all into some context, I know in your talk, which we're also going to be putting up on our site, you said that the natural gas reserves in Uzbekistan probably have the same value as the oil reserves in Iraq. So we're talking about a lot of gas here.
In Uzbekistan, they're not quite that big. They're significant, but they're in billions, not trillions, probably. Neighboring Turkmenistan, which only has 5 million people, those are the real thing to play for, where you're talking multiples of trillions of dollars worth of gas, worth more, I think, than the oil fields of Iraq. And how you then get that Uzbek and Turkmen gas out of Central Asia is the big game, and that necessitates a pipeline over Afghanistan.
So let's bring it back to, so the Bush administration was using Uzbekistan for this extraordinary rendition, essentially sending people to be tortured.
Yep.
There's an enormous gas in the region, giving it geopolitical significance as well as its role in the Afghan war. President Obama has said that the rendition is going to stop, but in fact they made a new deal for the base, or about to make a new deal for a military base in Uzbekistan. And do you believe the rendition has stopped? Is the torture actually over?
In 2005, the Bush administration fell out with the Uzbeks when they gave the gas contracts, which had belonged to Enron, and then had been passed on to another Texas company. They were revoked and given to Gazprom, and in return for a huge bribe paid to the dictator's daughter, Uzbekistan reversed its position and became a Russian ally. But at that time, it was stated by both sides that intelligence cooperation would continue. Whether that meant that extraordinary rendition continued, I'm not sure. The company Premier Executive, which was flying those people to Tashkent, they didn't operate any more flights, but I believe flights may have come in from Bagram since that time. But now the Obama administration is setting out to warm up relations with Uzbekistan. Again, there have been several high-level official and senior military, senior general visits to Uzbekistan since Obama came to power. In March, they signed a new deal on logistic provision by land routes to Uzbekistan to Afghanistan. And they've been in heavy negotiations to reopen a big American airbase in Uzbekistan. I don't believe those negotiations are quite concluded yet, but Obama is going out of his way to beef up Karimov.
And the administration is sending us, the American administration is sending signals the deal's about to be done. They seem pretty confident of it.
I think that's very likely. I think it's very likely that Uzbekistan will again be being hailed as a great American ally. So
just finally, what has this done to your view of the world? Your position of Britain and the United States, you were representing it as they say, the United States, the beacon on the hill?
Yeah. Well, I think my worldview has changed. I'd been a British diplomat for over 20 years, and I genuinely believed that on balance, we were a force for good in the world, that I wasn't serving something which was detrimental to mankind in general. And I would still justify that in a lot of the things I worked on, particularly in Africa. But suddenly to find that respect for international law had gone out the window, respect for basic human rights had gone out the window, and that people I'd worked with, people I knew, senior diplomats, were perfectly prepared to justify torture, to write memos against mine, justifying torture, to spread scare stories. Because you shouldn't forget the purpose of the torture was to get false intelligence which vastly exaggerated the threat from Al-Qaeda. It vastly exaggerated the strength of Al-Qaeda in Central Asia. And people knew that. It's not that officials, were true believers that this stuff was all. It was very cynical. People knew we were using torture to beef up the war on terror, to spread a false position in order to justify the alliance with this horrible regime, and that actually the alliance was all about oil and gas and getting a gas pipeline over Afghanistan out of Central Asia. But although people knew, they were happy to go along with it. And really, when something like that hits you, that the people you've worked with and called your friends for years and years and years are prepared to go along with something as evil as that resulted in torture and wars and death, it really does plunge you into questioning everything you ever believed in. And I still haven't really come out of that process.
Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us. And don't forget the book Murder in Samarkand. Am I pronouncing it correctly?
Samarkand.
Samarkand. I'm sure is available online and in stores. Thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.